The AFL, like all great sports, is rich in what-if scenarios. From potential big player trades to seemingly insignificant missed umpiring calls, all what-ifs have the potential to change the AFL landscape in drastic ways. But I think there's a potential argument to say that the proposed merger of the Hawthorn and Melbourne football clubs in 1996 could be the biggest what-if the AFL has seen. But to understand the scope of this what-if scenario, we first need to provide some context around Aussie rules football at the time of this proposed merger. Aussie rules football, and Australian sport in general, was unique amongst sporting codes up until late in the second half of the 20th century. As instead of a national league where teams from across the country competed in a wider Aussie rules competition, each state had their own Premier League, none more influential than the Victorian Football League. Around the mid-1980s, then VFL CEO Ross Oakley identified that the VFL needed to change. The league was starting to have to compete against the other big Aussie rules leagues in South Australia and Western Australia, and with national competitions for rugby league, basketball, soccer, and other sports starting to gain momentum, it was decided that the VFL needed to go nationwide. South Melbourne had already moved to Sydney in 1982, but there was still room for growth in Ross Oakley's eyes, and he saw the licence fees for new teams entering the competition as the salvation for the many financially struggling Victorian clubs at the time. So there were big plans for the league moving forward. The league became a major national competition over the next decade, with teams from Adelaide, Brisbane and Perth entering the league. The V was changed to an A to give birth to the Australian Football League, and the health of Aussie rules footy in Australia was strong. But for many struggling Victorian clubs promised a lifeline via expansion licences, it was a promise unchecked, and calls that a national league could realistically only support 6 to 8 Victorian teams didn't help. Clubs like St Kilda, Footscray and Fitzroy were amongst the hardest hit clubs. In the blinding light of the success of the national expansion, battling Victorian clubs were given a brutal set of solutions. Relocate to an interstate location, or merge clubs. However, it was not all doom and gloom, with a promised $6 million from the AFL to any new clubs formed from a merger. Proposed mergers included the Melbourne Demons and Fitzroy Lions becoming the Melbourne Lions, Fitzroy and Footscray becoming the Fitzroy Bulldogs, and the potential combination of North Melbourne and Fitzroy to become the North Fitzroy Kangaroos, a merger that got extremely close to being completed before Fitzroy would be essentially dissolved into the Brisbane Bears to become the Brisbane Lions. Most Victorian clubs were cited as a potential for some form of merger, with only the financially stable clubs in Carlton, Collingwood, Essendon and Geelong exempt from merger discussions. Fitzroy was truly the favourite candidate for a merger, as they were in a financial hole unlike any other club. But while all these bids were put forward in the 1990s, the Melbourne Football Club and Hawthorn Football Club were working on their own proposal. The merger of Melbourne and Hawthorn seemed to make more sense than the others. Rather than combining two financially unstable clubs, the combination of a financially sound club in Melbourne with a hugely successful but poor club in Hawthorn made perfect sense. Melbourne hadn't won a premiership since the 60s but had the money. Hawthorn had won 5 premierships in 9 years of recent history but were in debt. There were other reasons too. Hawthorn had established facilities and infrastructure, whereas Melbourne had the administration facility separate from its training ground, which was then separate from its social club. Both clubs also shared a middle to upper middle class supporter base, with a smaller membership base compared to the big Victorian and interstate clubs. On paper, this merger was a no-brainer. Negotiations between the two clubs moved quick, with various key aspects decided on eagerly. The team would become the Melbourne Hawks. The jumper would look like Melbourne's traditional outfit with a gold V to represent the gold from Hawthorn's colour scheme. The official colours would be Melbourne's red and blue combined with Hawthorn's gold, the brown of the Hawks being dropped. The Best and Fairest award would be named the Crimmins Truscott Trophy, and the theme song would be a combination of both clubs' original song, whatever that would sound like. Commentary at the time pointed out that Hawthorn would lose more identity than Melbourne, potentially due to their weaker bargaining position that the Hawks had with a poor financial position. Whether these claims are true is unknown. The package offered by the AFL would include a $6 million payout over 3 years, a $225,000 advance payout to help implement the merger, unrestricted access to both original clubs' lists to create a list of 44 players in 1997, dropping to the standard 38 by 1999, and permission to exceed the salary cap of then $2.9 million a year. This would be a $300k bonus in 1997, dropping to $100k by 1999. While both clubs and the AFL seemed keen on the surface for the merger to take place, there was pushback from a variety of places. The first being Operation Payback, led by ex-Hawthorn player Don Scott, and backed by other key Hawthorn figures like Dermott Brereton and Brian Falconer. Their goal was to launch an official motion against the proposal and fund a public campaign for an anti-merger case. Not long after, businessman Joe Gutnick and ex-Melbourne player Brian Dixon launched a similar anti-merger campaign from the perspective of Melbourne's fan base. Both campaigns brought in an uproar from fans of both teams, and even though both teams had supporters for and against the merger, the very general consensus was that Hawthorn fans didn't want it, but Melbourne fans did. In the last round of the 1996 AFL season, Melbourne and Hawthorn would play out what was likely their last game of the season, and potentially their last game as two different clubs. It became known as the merger game, and even though the Hawks would miraculously make finals and play one more game that season, the game was played with an energy and tension that personified the context of the potential merger at the time. Hawks supporters made a protest led by Don Scott leading to the game, capturing the feeling of the Hawks fan base. It was the Hawks that would prevail by 1 point in front of 63,000 people at the MCG. Jason Dunstall kicked 10 goals in a game where Chris Langford would hold up his Hawks jumper high after the game in defiance of the merger. An interesting side note about the game is that future 4-time Hawthorn Premiership coach Alastair Clarkson was playing for Melbourne in that game. Both clubs called general meetings. The Hawks hosted theirs at the Camberwell Civic Centre and the Demons hosting theirs at Dallas Brooks Hall. The venues were filled with members from both clubs, while supporters outside the venues watched the meeting take place on large monitors. Prior to both meetings, protests and chants rang throughout the car parks of both venues, as supporters made their feelings about the merger known to the boards inside. Triple Premiership Hawks coach Alan Jean was shouted down when he spoke about his support of the merger, and in a now iconic Hawthorn moment, Don Scott would hold up the proposed Melbourne Hawks jersey and rip off the hawk and gold strip to reveal a standard Melbourne jumper.
You take off, where's the brown? You take off a little bit of gold. What have you got? A Velcro hawk and a Melbourne Guernsey.
Aided by proxy votes and the inability for a large number of Melbourne members to get into the meeting to vote, the Melbourne Football Club voted 4,679 to 4,229 in favour of the merger. Over at Hawthorn's meeting, the vote was unanimous. The merger rejected 5,241 to 2,841. Following the result, large-scale resignations of both clubs' board resulted in key anti-merger campaigners taking their place. Ross Oakley decided it was time to resign as AFL CEO at the end of the season, and new CEO Wayne Jackson removed the $6 million merger incentive. The two clubs went their separate ways. Melbourne seeing moderate success after new president Joseph Gutnick injected $3 million into the club. However, they never could get another flag, despite a 2000 grand final appearance. The club would generally struggle on and off the field, with the Demons squandering in a new low point for much of the early 21st century until they finally broke their premiership drought in 2021. The Hawks, on the other hand, had a much more pleasant post-merger story. They were kind of nowhere following the merger into the early 2000s and began playing games in Tasmania to help their financial situation. But they would truly be vindicated when ex-Melbourne player Alistair Clarkson would coach them to a flag in 2008, shortly followed by a three-peat of flags from 2013 to 2015. While today both clubs boast a strong financial position, a modern-day story of success and strong club and supporter culture, it's interesting looking back on what might have been. The 2000s and 2010s may have been defined by a super team, the Melbourne Hawks, unstoppable on the field and supported by a monster fan base off the field. As a result, Geelong may still be suffering a premiership drought as the new Hawks dominated the era. Brisbane's three-peat may be limited to one or two flags as the Melbourne Hawks come off a 2000 grand final to find more success. Maybe teams like St Kilda and the Bulldogs never get a look in during the late 2010s. Alternatively, maybe the somewhat reckless spending of Hawthorn combined with Melbourne's lack of success may have resulted in a financially unstable and unsuccessful shambles of a club, destined to die in the near future anyway. The point is we'll never know, because it's one of the AFL's greatest what-if questions to debate. The story of two historic Melbourne-based clubs that, above all other mergers and expansions going on at the time, could have been the AFL's new powerhouse, unstoppable or unstable going into the new millennium. Alright, well thank you for joining me in the second video on this new kind of project YouTube channel of mine covering different AFL topics. I really appreciated the feedback in the last video about the Collingwood Premiership from 2023. I got a lot of feedback saying I should have included Oleg Markov's part of the story, which is absolutely correct. So thanks for that feedback. I'll make sure to be more thorough next time. But please leave any feedback and constructive criticism on this video as well if you have any. As far as I know, everything in this video is historically accurate. Feel free to comment below if anything isn't historically accurate. I tried to cross-check what I could, so I'm pretty sure it's all, good to go. Also, if there are any other topics you'd like me to cover, particularly from this era of the AFL, I find really interesting, kind of this era through to where we are now. I feel like there's a lot of great stories to tell. So if you have any particular stories or docos you'd like to see, leave them in the comments below. I just want to touch on a few things featured in this video. Firstly, I wanted to say that the song that they came up with that combined Melbourne and Hawthorn's theme song, I thought was actually really good. You can find full videos on YouTube of the song if you want to hear the full thing. But I think it's a bit of a banger. They did really well to combine both and it not sound, really dumb. But yeah, I'm just really fascinated by this period of time for the AFL when they were trying to get rid of, well, I guess not get rid of, but trying to slim down on how many clubs were in Victoria, particularly based in Melbourne. I think it's probably something that even today probably needs to happen. I know it's very controversial and, these days there's all the teams have bigger fan bases, so it's a harder thing to do, but I think there are still too many clubs in Victoria when there's no club in, Canberra, which has traditionally been actually a pretty big footy state until the last 30 or 40 years when the Canberra Raiders from the NRL went there. And, Northern Territory, which I know has a small population, but they're diehard footy fans up there. So it doesn't really make a lot of sense we have so many teams. But, you'll never catch me naming what teams should go because that just upsets so many people. And you know what? If the AFL is happy keeping Victorian teams like they are, then so be it. I would love to know what your thoughts are on this, though, and what your thoughts are on this particular Hawthorn and Melbourne merger. What do you think might have happened eventually? So please leave those thoughts in the comments below, as well as any other thoughts and feedback. And I will see you in the next video, which I think I might give you a clue, if it is the next video, will be about the Barassi line and how that has changed Australian sporting culture over the years. So anyway, look forward to that, and I will see you in that video.